My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm the co-owner and managing director with Impetus Digital. So for those of you who don't know what Impetus Digital is our company has built some of the best in class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools for life science companies to be able to have interactions, conversations, to do work with their customers, be it physicians, payers, patients, or allied healthcare providers. And we do this under the auspices of advisory boards or investigator meetings, co-author working groups. And I'm sure you could probably imagine, since the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people have been virtualizing internal meetings, plan of action rollouts to the field force, and brand planning, etc. At Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. It's actually, quite frankly, the reason for these fireside chats. We believe some of these provocative discussions on topics that are timely are the things that are truly going to start to positively disrupt healthcare. And so we are really, really happy to have one of these inventive and creative thinkers with Ryan Wiley at the table today. And I'm very, very honored to have him here. For those of you, I'm sure many of you already know, but for those of you who don't know Ryan Wiley, Dr. Ryan Wiley, he is actually the president of Shift Health. They're a company that brings a science mindset to the strategy consulting for health research and the innovation ecosystem. So since joining Shift Health, he started actually in 2004, and he has helped to grow the company into one of the most dynamic and trusted advisory teams in the health and life sciences arena, with footholds not only in North America, but in Europe as well as in the Middle East. So great work on that one. Ryan has also worked with some of the world's largest biopharmaceutical and life science companies to support their product development, their market access strategies globally, as well as with non-governmental and philanthropic organizations. So he's worked with government departments, agencies, academic institutions, as well as hospital-based research institutes. And for which he's helped to mobilize more than $1 billion for healthcare research and development. Ryan received his PhD in immunology from McMaster University, where he is actually now an adjunct professor. He is also a policy advisor to and past chair of Research Canada. He's a co-chair of Life Sciences Ontario Annual Policy Forum, and he's the director on the boards of AMREF Health Africa and the Canadian International Health Education Association and Can Health International. So we certainly are speaking to somebody who knows what they're talking about. It's going to be a very interesting and intriguing conversation. I can't wait to start. So welcome, Ryan.
Thank you, Natalie. You clearly used the version of my CV that my mother wrote, but thank you for that.
Lovely. So Ryan, why don't we actually get started with you first? Sure. I think you have a very robust and interesting career. You started your career as a scientist, so you have a research inclined mind and brain, and you have a PhD degree in immunology. And now you're a part-time assistant professor at Mac. So what kind of caused you to jump from academia into the consulting world?
Well, thanks for that question. I can tell you that when I decided to do my PhD, I certainly wasn't thinking of consulting as a future career. I didn't know what consulting was when I started my PhD, and what I did know, I was sort of questioning why anyone would pay for that kind of service. But I went into my PhD, driven by a passion for my field, immunology, but also by a passion for science and the scientific method. And I had the sense that literacy in the scientific method, in inquiry, was probably a pretty transferable and marketable skill. And so during my PhD, I began to explore different career options, learned a lot more about consulting, and realized that consulting in many ways, at least strategy consulting, which we do, is in some ways perfect for the scientist, because you confront a problem or a question, you raise hypotheses about why that problem exists and what might help to solve it. you design an approach to investigate it and test that solution or those hypotheses, and you come up with some recommendations and conclusions, generally over a shorter time scale than a discovery scientist can achieve impact. So that was my journey. I actually started at Shift Health, as you pointed out, in aging me, in 2004. I started as an intern, and I guess the rest is history. But I just wanted to make one other comment on your question, because I'm asked that question a lot. And I think it speaks to this that the destiny of a scientist has a particular path, and that is to become, a principal investigator leading a research lab at a university. But the reality is that most people who do their PhDs are not going to end up in a research lab. There is a huge a range of career options for people who have done a science-based PhD, very rich and rewarding careers. So I kind of look forward to the day when I'm not asked the question, why did you transition from academia, but rather when that question is put onto an academic, why did you stay in academia? Which is a bit cheeky, but I think, for those in the audience who are thinking of doing a PhD, I can only say it's a very, very marketable skill.
Beautiful, I love it. You have done some tremendous work, obviously with Shift Health internationally. So I was wondering if you could just encapsulate for us what Shift Health does. What is your mandate, your objectives, your vision, and what makes you different from other consulting firms?
Well, great question. I think you actually covered it very well in the introduction, but we are a strategy firm for the health research and innovation ecosystem. So we're very focused on supporting organizations that are doing research and engage in innovation and helping them move that innovation to achieve patient impact. That's our vision. We want to invent the future of healthcare, and that's what our clients want to do as well. I think what distinguishes us as a firm, back to my earlier comments, is the science mindset that we bring to our work. We are curious about the questions that our clients present. We're rigorous in our approach, and we provide very deep insights. And this reflects 20 years of experience working with life sciences organizations really across the continuum. It reflects the capabilities of our team, almost all of whom are like me, with PhDs. They're scientists who really bring that deep knowledge and that deep content and bridge that into business. And I think it also reflects our integrated picture of the ecosystem. So we work with industry, with academia, not-for-profits, healthcare providers, patient groups, and health charities really around the world. So bring that total picture in terms of how innovation and how research work and can achieve impact.
I love it, and I love bringing that very nonpartisan perspective that makes people feel very at ease, but is also very data-centric, which I think really makes, pulls that all together. So Ryan, why we're here at the table today is I recently saw you participating in a webinar with the Life Sciences Ontario, and I was really, really impressed with your opening presentation, which was also based on a report that your company has recently published. And we'll make sure that we provide that as a link to this, because I really highly recommend people read it. It's really well put together. And I want to go over some of the 5 principles or the 5 tenets of that particular report, because I think that it's so relevant to so many people around the life sciences table and in healthcare in general. So the first point that you really brought up that I thought was so important was you quoted this as saying, this is the end of the beginning of health digitalization. And you explain how COVID-19 is almost like the change accelerant or setting the stage for this, if you will, future-proofing of the data ecosystem that we're in. And so it's kind of like the silver lining to this, but how do you sort of see this, the beginning of the end, and what has COVID-19 meant to all of us around the table?
Well, great question, and thank you for posing that. I think there are 3 important observations that I would make in terms of what COVID-19 is showing us about health data and digitalization. I think the first is that COVID-19 has made it impossible for us to continue ignoring the limitations of our health data. We have seen many instances of our inability to respond efficiently or effectively to COVID-19 because the data we have, the data sets we have are low quality, they're not interoperable, they're not interpretable, and they're therefore not actionable. So, there are many examples of that. Early in the pandemic, our World in Data, which is a wonderful resource, stopped using WHO data in its reporting because the data were completely unreliable. And this is not to indict the WHO. It really is a reflection of the inconsistent data standards among the member states who are providing data to the WHO, which were making globally consequential decisions. So, and that's true in Canada as well. Our own data on COVID-19, the data that we collect, have made it impossible for us to really understand the impact of COVID-19 in important subpopulations, including the elderly, including Indigenous communities across the country, because we're just not collecting this data. So I think people recognize that we need to do much, much better. I think the second important thing that COVID-19 has unleashed, and this is, you mentioned that it's an accelerant, and it has been an accelerant, because we're seeing a lot of very progressive data and digital health implementation in the context of COVID-19. It's happening very, very quickly, but it has long-term implications. So in Ontario, for example, the Ministry of Health recently implemented Panther, which is an integrated data health platform to help to support evidence-based decision-making in the context of COVID-19, but has larger implications for future pandemics, future health emergencies, and beyond. But we also know that those jurisdictions that already had strong data infrastructure were able to respond to the pandemic very, very effectively. South Korea is a very good example, being able to use not simply personal health data from a clinic, but apps, CCTV, your cell phone in terms of GPS to do excellent contact tracing and really keep the pandemic under control. So, you're seeing those progressive policies being adapted and used, and we're learning from them. And I think the third important thing that COVID-19 has done in terms of data is that it's shown how important collaboration and partnership is. It's critical to our ability to share data across jurisdictions, across institutions, across boundaries in order to make better decisions. But that partnership also extends to the public. I mean, the extent to which the public has been engaged in sharing individual personal data in order to support our response, in order to support public health officials' ability to track infection and see clusters of incidents. I don't think public health officials expected that degree of public engagement and public partnership. And that, I think, is in many ways giving me the greatest hope that this is a turning point for health digitalization, because if the public is not on board, we're not going to achieve anything.
So there's a lot of really important nuggets in there, Ryan, and I probably just want to pull some of those and linger on some of those core concepts, because there was a lot there. The first piece that I wanted to sort of dissect is some of the infrastructure compliance setup that we have in the organizations, infrastructure that we have built around us. So obviously, directly here is the Ontario Ministry of Health, and this new opportunity, for example, with the new integrated health data platform. But as we start to also talk about some of the new policies and the accelerations of software as a medical device and other things like prescriptive digital therapeutics, there's sort of an accelerant while at the same time, we're bumping heads with other people who are screaming, data security,
Yeah.
surveillance, privacy versus what's shared, what's owned. I don't want my stuff in a data lake. So we're seeing this combat that's happening. And I think this is all panning out in the way, like you were suggesting, contact tracing has been incorporated.
Yeah.
So certain jurisdictions in the US have spent millions of dollars on physical human contact tracers, while Google and Apple are trying to solicit use of their algorithm to make it smarter and usable, and kind of butting heads there. So that's just kind of a concrete example of that butting of heads. What's your thoughts on what people are doing to sort of overcome that issue?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a work in progress, clearly, but I think it is a wake-up call, particularly for policymakers and regulators and privacy ethicists, in terms of what we can do and what we should be doing. You mentioned a number of sort of technological changes or sort of acceleration of technology that we're seeing, whether it's artificial intelligence or the use of virtual clinical trials or the use of telemedicine, which has been widely adopted and is probably a permanent change. So, what I'm very hopeful for, almost optimistic, is that we're beginning to see a change in mindset with respect to health data, with respect to the importance of collecting it and how we collect it and the kind of data that we collect and value, our approaches to ensuring the quality of those data, our approaches to sharing those data, and our approaches to applying those data, not simply clinical data, but more broadly real world evidence. We're seeing it happen in COVID-19, and we're seeing the benefits of doing so. So I think a couple of things. One, this may be, this experience may be driving a sense of urgency that we really do need to accelerate health digitalization if we're to be ready for the next pandemic and if we're to deal with all of the other health challenges we face. I think it's also driving perhaps a change in mindset with respect to privacy, as you put it, moving perhaps from a stance that privacy is absolutely sacrosanct and any risk to privacy must be avoided, to recognizing that the risk of not sharing data is actually greater than the manageable risk of sharing personal health data, as long as we're using the right technologies and tools to protect to protect individuals and their privacy. I think the reality is that coming out of COVID-19, health system budgets are going to be enormously constrained, and there'll be an even greater recognition that we need to go digital so that we can actually make much better decisions at the individual patient level about what's working and what's not, and to stop things that are not working, and we can't do that without great data. And the final thing I'll say, is returning to my previous point, is that we have to, again, digitalization is going to be driven by the public. We have to recognize what the public wants. The public wants to share data, provided that the data are properly used to benefit individuals and to benefit public health at the end of the day. I think there's an assumption that the public does not want to share data for fear of privacy. In fact, the public wants to share data for fear that if we don't, our health is in jeopardy. And so I think that's a mindset shift that is happening, and that I think is very positive.
And, I guess just to finish on the first point of the report is you brought up some other key components that I'd love to get your further deeper dive opinion on. One of them is really, so this whole thing about bioethics and privacy, this is a whole other conversation that's going to require a lot of work. In Canada, we have a digital charter.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't think the average Canadian citizen even knows that that exists. Yeah. There's a whole opportunity of education that we haven't even scratched the surface as a life science ecosystem or community. And layered on that, so what's really interesting about that is actually going to expose a risk-benefit conversation that's going to be not unlike the risk-benefit conversation that took place with what happened with COVID-19, which was, do you turn on the economy and you get people back to work, or is this about the health come? And so there's almost like an economic analysis that's going on, and there's a balance.
Yeah.
And I think layered on that is this need for constant invention and being able to support with new exponential technologies to leverage the data, to build on it, and to create an interoperable related system. So there's this continued observation around, what are we doing to educate the digital citizen, and participating in this opportunity to create the infrastructure and the support, potentially even financially, to bring in this interoperability.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. I don't have much to add to what you just said, because I think what you said is spot on. Digital literacy is critical. More broadly, scientific literacy is critical in the public, and I think this, COVID-19 has shone the spotlight on the importance of health data, on the importance of science. So this is a moment to engage with the public and to awaken that knowledge and that interest. And it's not rocket science. Many other jurisdictions, Norway being a notable example, do it extremely well. They have actually, I don't know if you've seen this, they have, I think it's Norway, it's one of the Nordic countries, they have an online course, public, on AI, just literacy in AI. What is it? And just so everyone's at a common level. We should absolutely be doing that in Canada. The second thing, with respect to that interoperability, I think it speaks to the importance of, frankly, in Canada, federal, national leadership in creating a health data ecosystem. We cannot have fragmentation in the way that we can't have interoperability if we have fragmentation across provinces, across institutions. It requires a coherent national agenda and a national strategy. In fact, it needs to go beyond the national. It needs to be international in nature, but let's at least get our own house in order.
I love it. Love the perspective. I want to move forward on the second tenet of your report. With your mentioning that, again, that COVID-19 had a major impact and continues to have a major impact on the way we're approaching clinical research. So again, that's kind of your key forte here. There's been a lot of impact on the way clinical trials have had to stop. Some people have had to pivot. They've had to look at their clinical endpoints. Maybe they needed to rethink real world evidence, potentially collecting censored devices to have patients enter them from whatever location. But part of all of that, there has been also this incredible seamless international cooperation that has been going on as well. So there's been the good, bad, and the ugly.
Yeah.
Can you actually talk a little bit about what you have seen with your discussions with the life science clients that you work with?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot in that question, and maybe I'll just start by sort of talking about how we've really seen in the context of COVID-19 how it's possible to really accelerate research broadly and clinical research specifically, provided that we're sort of triangulating safety, quality, and speed. That these are not incompatible ideas. Speed and quality are not incompatible, but we're seeing ways to really amplify and accelerate research while maintaining safety and quality. But we're seeing it in ways that are good, and we're seeing that in ways that are bad. So I think there are some things that are going to really continue into the future, and some that are not. Let me give you a couple of examples. So to accelerate clinical research, there are two ways you can do that. One is you can actually lower the standard, or you can look at the process and see, are there steps in this process that are gratuitous or redundant and are not really helping us achieve the standard. And we've seen examples of both in the context of COVID-19. On the very positive side, you look at the WHO's Solidarity Trial, for example, which is it's a massive multinational, multi-component, multi-partner study under a master protocol with the ability to use real-time data that are coming in to change the trial parameters, optimize the trial, and therefore accelerate our ability to develop new diagnostics, new treatments, and new vaccines. It's a really powerful mechanism to accelerate science and clinical research. Likewise, you're seeing a real explosion in the use of preprint publication. So getting the data out there as quickly as possible, even before formal peer review. Let the community see the data. Let the community judge its merit as a whole, not just a handful of reviewers. But then on the other side, so those are examples of I think changes that are really looking at process and opportunities to accelerate, and they will endure in many ways. But then you look at some decisions that have really, been based on the premise that we want to go faster, but have actually ultimately reduced quality. They've reduced the standard. Early in the pandemic, you may recall that there was enormous pressure, political pressure, on the FDA, the U.S. FDA, to get new diagnostic tests into clinics and hospitals as quickly as possible. And so they actually made the unprecedented decision to suspend the requirement to validate the tests before they were used. And this resulted in a flood of spurious tests into the market. Some of them were outright fraudulent, and it forced the FDA to reverse that decision. So, the regulator here, responsible for clinical integrity, making a decision to lower standards, completely backfired. So, these are the lessons that I think we're learning from this, that it is possible to optimize speed, quality, and safety, provided that you're looking at process as opposed to lowering the standard. And I think if anything comes out of this, I think it'll be a recognition that greater regulatory harmonization across the globe will be needed in order to accelerate clinical research in the future. If a company has to get ethics approval or regulatory approval for the same study in the same population in every single institution and every single country that in which it wishes to operate, it's profoundly inefficient and very, very expensive, and it delays getting innovation to people, when at the end of the day, the standards are all just about the same, and ultimately it's about a human standard that should apply equally to everyone. So I think regulatory harmonization in clinical research is something that we're going to see a lot more of in the future.
So I'd love to get your perspective on that, because I think that's a very juicy, provocative topic. So as you see in Canada, there's a globalization, if you will, or a centralization of things like pharmacare and, a standardized approval body. And if we took that up a notch, which is what you're suggesting, into a global arena, which is a WHO version of a regulatory department or some sort of approval stamp body, there is potentially concern of you're either in or you're out, and concerns. And I think we're also in this really interesting pivotal place in this time point where we're conflicting between regionalization and all of this talk that you're hearing about regionalizing supply chain, all these things, at the same time that we're having this conversation about globalization.
Yeah.
So where do we fit into this? I mean, what is kind of the right balance based on the conversations you've had?
Yeah. I think that's a very, very good question. Maybe I'll try to unpack it a little bit, because the globalization question, I think in COVID-19, we're seeing and what I've said before is sort of two sides of the globalization coin here. On the one hand, we're seeing that in many ways we're in this mess because of globalization, right? Because of our interconnected systems, because of our interconnected supply chains and the efficiency of those supply chains, resulting in a lack of redundancy, because our world is so connected in terms of travel and migration, the infection can spread. So all of these aspects of modernity are driving the pandemic. But I would also say that the other side is that globalization is going to save us. Connectivity is going to save us, because these are the challenges we face. COVID-19, other pandemics, other health challenges are global in nature. They're interconnected in nature. And I think there's a growing recognition that we need to work together as a global community to tackle them. And we need to do it in a way that recognizes the interconnectivity between human health, the sustainability of social systems, and the sustainability of ecological systems. So I think there is an awakening and a sense of urgency around the need to optimize those global connections in order to drive innovation and address challenges. And I think, very importantly, that awareness is creating opportunities for greater global health justice at the end of the day, because we recognize that it is not enough for the industrialized North to get together, cooperate, and address the pandemic. If solutions, if engagement with some of the most vulnerable populations and countries in the world does not occur, we're not going to be able to tackle. We're not going to be able to solve this problem. This is truly a global challenge. We're all vulnerable unless we're all part of it. So I think, again, there are definitely going to be major, there's going to be major push to optimize supply chains and to ensure national health security. That doesn't change, but there's also, we can't forget that our problems are global. We need to work together, and that globalization, in that broader sense, is the answer.
So taking it down one slight notch from the more global perspective of, do we work together or, do we work disparately? So taking it down more at an organizational level. Yeah. The way the current life sciences paradigm has been is we've built companies. Each company has their own boundaries, their own products, their own revenue streams, their own research trials. And this is the way we have always worked. Yeah. Now comes in COVID-19, but really, quite frankly, a new economy. And so we're having these data lakes. I'd like to say one day, maybe data oceans, as we increase interoperability, is we're looking at this opportunity for data sharing and potentially the development of a new idea around what a company is. Is it really just interested individuals surrounding around a problem and then having a finite start and stop time with a product and then disbanding that? There's some opportunities for some new business models. We're even seeing some of this happening now with the advent of Transcelerate. Never before have we seen, an incorporation of multinationals in one entity. I think you've also mentioned Canada's NRC Pandemic Response Challenge Program. So we're at this juxtaposition of asking ourselves this question is, what is the new business model of the future? And what would you forecast as being the best way forward? Yeah,
so you're absolutely right. We are seeing new collaborative models form and new business strategies form, whether that's government to government collaboration or academic to private sector or private sector to private sector. And Transcelerate, as you've mentioned, is I think a good example of that. But I think it's important to recognize that science has always been collaborative, right? So collaboration itself is not new, but it's more that the pace of the formation of these collaborations and the experimentation with new models has really accelerated. So I think one thing that will come out of this is a recognition that partnerships can form really quickly when there's a will and there's a sense of urgency to do so, and they can be effective, and you can align interests. So a partnership that might have taken years to develop and negotiate, they're now forming in a week or two, and that's, I think that changes expectations with respect to how quickly we can move and mobilize. But I think as well, we're really amplifying the power of these collaborations to achieve results. The compression of the time to develop a vaccine, which would normally take a decade, and we're compressing this into a year or a year and a half, probably. That changes public expectations, right? Why should I wait 10 years for a vaccine when, if you work together, we can get a solution much more quickly? And so I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on governments and on the private sector to find those collaborative models. And I think the third thing is it is forcing companies and innovators to rethink what that pre-competitive space looks like. The idea of data exclusivity, ownership of data and knowledge and property. Intellectual property is not going to go away. That's a huge economic driver for invention. And short of changing our whole sort of economic system, that incentive to innovate is there. But I think companies are increasingly asking themselves, well, do I not benefit more if I give up a little bit of data exclusivity now? Because in the long run, that's going to save me a whole lot of time and money and energy and resources and mistakes, because we're sharing information, we're learning from each other, and we're able to refine our trajectory so that we can get to the end point more quickly. I think that's what we're seeing here. And as you mentioned, Transcelerate is a great example. Transcelerate existed before the pandemic, but it's a collaboration, for those of you who don't know, it's a collaboration of 20 biopharmaceutical companies that are sharing clinical data and actually control arms so that they can advance their own innovation programs more quickly. You're going to see a lot more use of models like Transcelerate in the future.
I love it, and I find it very advancing, and it's wonderful to see that, and hope to see more of it.
Yes.
Taking it down even a further notch down at the more clinical research level, so at the day-to-day basics of how we do research. There's a lot of discussion that has been going on since the COVID-19, especially since people have had to reflect and pause, since many clinical trials have had to abruptly stop. Yeah. To really do some navel gazing and say, okay, how do we deal with this in the future? Not only from how trials are done, for some of the ways that we've been discussing around cooperation and data sharing, but really at the day-to-day, what does that model look like? Is it going to become more digital? How are patients going to be involved? Does it have to be, can it become location agnostic? Another key component to this also has to do with the endpoints that are being used in clinical studies. A lot of people are asking the question of, there's a balance between cost effectiveness, and sort of, we always talk about this when we start doing the market analysis and market access evaluations. There's a balance between this cost utility and the level of resilience of these endpoints. So resilience is this new term that we're using to encompass everything. So how does this apply in your forecast about the way clinical trials are going to be started and investigated moving forward?
Great question. A couple of things come to mind. One is certainly, to your point, we're going to see increased use of virtual technologies to administer clinical trials. It's beneficial to patients. It simplifies the process for them. It also allows patients who otherwise can't routinely travel to an academic health center in downtown Toronto, for example, to participate. So it actually expands the population who will have access to innovation. So there's a huge incentive to do that. Patients want it, and I suspect that clinical researchers want it because it means that their trials will not have to completely stop when a pandemic arises like this. So I think that we're definitely going to see a lot more of that. I think we're going to see as well then an expansion of the kinds of health professionals who can actually lead clinical trials, right? And Health Canada very recently changed the regulations to say that their practitioners, nurse practitioners, among others, can be the investigator on the trial as opposed to a physician. And I think that broadening is a benefit to the healthcare system and to patients. So I think those changes are material. But I think as well, you raised an important point about endpoints, because a clinical trial is completely artificial. It is controlled. It's a very important tool for us to understand efficacy and safety in a particular population, but it doesn't reflect necessarily the real world. What happens after the trial, for example, because when you administer an approved product outside of a clinical trial, you're putting it in the real world. So I think you're going to see a lot more use of, and I hope you see a lot more use of real world evidence in terms of assessing effectiveness of a particular intervention, which you can then actually do at the individual patient level in real time. And that's obviously of first and foremost of benefit to the patient, because if it's not working in me, why am I using it? Because I'm a real person, not a hypothetical person in a clinical study. But it also very much benefits both the companies that are innovating and the healthcare system, because it allows for models of paying for innovation that are based on value. And if you're using data well, using real world evidence well, you can actually assess the true value of a particular intervention. So, if you're thinking about health system sustainability in the future, that's going to be, I think, pivotal.
The patient centricity part to what you're saying weighs really heavily in this equation, and what this looks like beyond just sort of saying patient centricity and actually doing it. One of the things that comes to mind, and we also talked a little bit about the advent of exponential technologies in the healthcare space. We've talked about artificial intelligence as an example, machine learning. We obviously are right in the mainstay of telemedicine, which really isn't new technology. It's been around for a while, but we're using it now. But one of the things that comes to mind is this idea of blockchain. Not that we need to talk about blockchain per se, but more of these, the decentralized ledger concept, where, let's face it, there is going to be this eventual demonetization and democratization of data. Data is the new oil that we all rely on, or that the machines are going to learn that rely on, right? So there is going to be this question of how patients can participate more robustly and in part of the clinical trials, not only in potentially crowdsourcing funding, working with other people with similar parameters, health conditions, et cetera, to look into a problem and create their own clinical study, to putting their data on the blockchain or this distributed ledger and be able to have people access it. And unlike today, be able to get paid small amounts of money for whoever ends up tapping into their data. Do you see that as being science fiction? What is your thought about that fairly outrageous, and some people might call it pretty scary concept, in your opinion?
Well, I don't think it's outrageous or science fiction necessarily. But what I would say is, to get to that point, we have to have a very engaged public, not just patients, but a very engaged public and a very literate public on matters of digitalization, on artificial intelligence, on blockchain, on science broadly. And if we don't achieve that, then we're not going to be able to build the trust that is essential to allowing people to share their data freely and safely and in a way that benefits themselves first and foremost and broader society. And I would say that in the context of COVID-19, we have a moment to awaken that engagement and that literacy. I'm quite optimistic about that because we are seeing that the public is looking to science for the answer. The science is the star here in ways that it hasn't been before. And so we're seeing an elevation of trust. You're seeing it in the US, for example, where people are listening to what Anthony Fauci has to say and ignoring, hopefully, what Donald Trump is saying about the pandemic. So, you really see that, and you see that even in, at the grassroots level in Canada, where people are creating apps to share data about COVID-19, about our symptoms, so that we can report that to public health agencies and they can use that. So there's this sense of we want to contribute and we want to be part of science, but we have to seize this moment very carefully because trust is fragile, and so I think as we go forward, the scientific community, the data community, needs to be really focused on genuine engagement with the public and accountability to the public. We really, as scientists, need to involve patients and the public throughout the research process, to your point, not simply as clinical subjects in a trial, but actually in shaping the research agenda and in helping to potentially interpret the implications of the results. I think as a community of digital innovators and scientists, we need to be much better at public communication and scientific communication. It's incumbent on us to find the words to engage with an intelligent public, and so I think and also to humanize science, and it shouldn't be this monolithic alien thing that is scary and that as a member of the public I can't engage with. On the contrary, it is a human invention. It's a human construct, and it's fallible like every other human construct, and it's stronger the more people who are involved in it. So I think this is, I've probably gone beyond the question that you were asking, but I think to achieve the kind of science fiction that you sort of described, we need to have an engaged, literate public.
So here's the next obvious question, which is, what's taking us so long? So sometimes I realize that you have to go slow to go fast. Yeah. But in your analysis, based on you taking a perspective on what the Canadian, what Canada is doing versus the US versus Europe and others, is there a specific health system that's doing it better or wiser or faster? Yeah. And for those countries, and I'm not suggesting that Canada is one of them, but it could be, is for the ones who are kind of plodding and kind of dragging their feet a bit, what do you think the fear is? What do you think is going on in the hearts and minds of the individuals in those countries that are preventing major, quickness to the feet or disruption or real inventiveness? What is your perspective on that, and what can we do to accelerate what we're doing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you certainly see in places like Singapore, for example, and obviously it's a very different, geographically in terms of population size, etc. It's very different from Canada, but you see there a public that recognizes science and innovation as central to the future that state. And the level of science education and literacy, the level of engagement, and the level of pride, frankly, in the broader innovation ecosystem is tangible, and it's inspiring. And it reflects a strategic government decision to make innovation the driver of economic growth and prosperity in Singapore, but it can be replicated elsewhere. I think part of Canada is a very complex country. We have historically been resource dependent. We're resource rich. A lot of our wealth derives from resources, and that perhaps, and I'm speculating, reduces the sense of urgency that one needs to really invest in innovation and creating in the future, because we can just pull it out of the ground and sell it and on global markets and succeed. That's a generalization, but I think that mindset is present in Canada, that we are a resource economy. But I think we need to recognize, of course, that our greatest resource is the talent of our people, the intelligence and the creativity of our citizens. And I think that perhaps COVID-19 is accelerating that awareness, but I think that's that mindset needs to sort of drive our social and economic agenda in the future.
Love it. That's very, very well said. I'd love to know, before I go to a question here, is what is your company's mandate moving forward based on all of the things you've collected, these really pivotal ideas in the report that you just generated? They're big, crunchy, audacious, provocative ideas. What is your hope and what is your plans to help move the needle on some of these issues and topics we've discussed today?
Yeah. Well, our goal is to ensure that the lessons that we've learned in COVID-19 and the positive changes that we've seen in the health research and innovation ecosystem are not lost, that we don't lose them, that we don't really disparage the lives that have been lost or affected by COVID-19 by taking this moment and doing something positive in the future, so that we can, apply this. We often talk about the war against cancer or the war against Alzheimer's disease. But we're actually seeing in COVID-19 what we can do when we actually apply a wartime mindset to an acute problem. So my goal is to see how we can apply that wartime mindset, and I don't like the metaphor of war, but everyone's using it, so I will, that wartime mindset to all of the other health challenges we face, which are global in nature, which are interconnected in nature, and which are, frankly, the cause of far greater mortality and socioeconomic burden than COVID-19 in the long run.
We have a question here that wants to find out, we talked a little bit about risks, and we talked about the risks of not sharing. They want to find out what you believe to be the risks of not sharing data versus sharing. And really wanted to know if anybody's actually quantitatively or qualitatively actually studied this yet.
Yeah. Yes. So yes, one can qualitatively and quantitatively study risk of sharing data, and it's going to be context specific, obviously. But when I talk about the risk of not sharing data, I'm talking about the how it impoverishes our ability to make evidence-based decisions that can ultimately benefit the public, individuals and public health as a whole. If I don't have good information about what's happening in my community, reliable information about what's happening in my community, then I'm not able to make that decision. And therefore lives could be lost, or there could be an increased morbidity. Is that risk less tolerable to us than the fairly remote risk that there will be a breach of data privacy, or that there will be some kind of security breach in our data systems. No system is 100% foolproof, but there are lots of technologies to secure our data. So that's the kind of risk benefit that I think we need to evaluate, recognizing that if we simply say that that any risk of data privacy breach is unacceptable, then we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to make any progress as a community. And frankly, our current systems are not impervious to security breach. So let's be honest about what we're talking about here.
I love it, and it's a very authentic answer, so thank you for that, Ryan. I just wanted to say I could probably speak to you for hours and hours. This is really important stuff. We're just scratching the surface. But as everybody knows, this is what we really believe at Impetus, that these conversations are the things that are going to start traction, that are going to start helping to move the needle on these big, hairy, audacious challenges and opportunities. At Impetus, we provide a collaborative platform where you as a life science company can have people like Ryan Wiley and other great advisors having comments and discussions. How do you think beyond the pill? How do we start involving patients and getting the digital charters involved? How do we start working with digital therapeutics? So these are really big kinds of concepts that you can work collaboratively and virtually with an assortment of advisors across the globe using the Impetus Insight platform. For many of you who may want to connect with Ryan, we will be leaving a link to his LinkedIn profile and to his company Shift Health if you do want to work with their organization and helping to strategize in some of the work that you're doing. Please also look for the link and the email. We'll be providing this recording if you want to share it with any of your colleagues. And there will also be posted on multiple social media posts. So look for us on Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Thank you very much, Ryan, for your time today and your brilliant ideas. It's so enjoyable. And I want to thank all of our audience, both here and who are going to be listening later. Thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Natalie. Bye-bye.
Thank you.